Hereafter Our Sister, a Pride and Prejudice variation, inspired by Jane Austen, written by Marley Joy Hawkins, and read by the author. Chapter 1. Happily Settled at Netherfield, 1789 to 1793, Hertfordshire. Conversation between a gentleman and his lady, while confined together in a chaise, is not often of interest to anyone besides themselves. However, Louis Bingley and Mary, his wife, had not been so long married that their conversation was a tedious recitation of complaints, nor so recently wed that we should blush to accidentally catch some part of their whispered endearments. Rather, they had not yet celebrated 5 years of marriage, and had been content with each other more often than not. As the summer weather made driving in an open chaise pleasurable, they left the coach for their servants and children, and chose to travel from London to Hertfordshire in the landaulet. The cover of that attractive carriage was left open, and I feel that we need not be ashamed to hear what the tiger sitting behind them could not miss. "Louis, dear, are you not a little pleased to live like a gentleman?"
"I fear not. I feel like a fraud. I'm a man of business, Mary. Lazing about in the country is not for me."
"But think of little Charlie, my love, and the respect he shall gain. And besides, who better than his own father to set him up in the way of farming?"
"Anyone who knows something about it would be better. Another line of trade I could easily learn, and I believe I could even like it. But cattle and fences and various crops are a tedious subject. The primary trouble is I am ignorant, and I know these country gentlemen will look down their aristocratic noses at me, the way the toffs in town did to my father. Why, after such treatment, he should want his grandson to be one of them, I cannot comprehend."
Not for the first time, Louis wondered if he should have named the boy after his mother's father instead of his own. Undoubtedly, it would not have mattered. Charles Bingley coveted the rights and privileges, airs and manners of the landed gentry, and he wanted his grandson to be accepted among them. This was how little Charlie Bingley became the owner of Netherfield Park before he had seen 1 year through. Of course, the estate was entrusted to his father's management until he reached 21. It was this that made Louis squirm with discomfort. Smoothing the fine fabric of her fashionable, if overly embellished, travelling suit, Mary could only sigh. "I confess I like the idea of being a lady and mistress of an estate very well."
"Even if it is not your own? Are you not a little ashamed that it will be your infant son's house you keep? Will you not lose respect for a layabout husband living off the interest of his son's fortune?"
"Pshaw, Louis Bingley, you do not even know how to lay about. You will pace around like the beasts in the king's menagerie. And as for fortune, you've made your own, I dare say, and will make it grow too. No matter what your father says, he needs you. That is why he worked so hard to make Mr. Morris sell Netherfield. It is close enough to town that he can call you back to help him now and then." This speech earned her a smile and an affectionate pat before she started to feel a light rain. Fearing for the silk on her bonnet, Mary asked her husband to stop and close the cover. The driver pulled to the side and, together with the tiger, closed them in. The boy happened to sneeze just after securing the latch, drawing the attention of his mistress. As a mother, she could not be entirely comfortable with leaving a 12-year-old boy to ride behind them in the rain, and insisted the tiger join the party within the coach. Louis Bingley was very fond of his wife. He had learned early that in some matters she was beyond the reach of reason. For the sake of domestic felicity, he simply acquiesced, which circumstance mortified the boy and caused the coachman to snort in disgust. Louis ignored them all, and quietly told the boy he could resume his place when they changed horses, so long as he kept out of Mrs. Bingley's sight. Disgraced, he rode in the coach along with the lady's maid and valet, who looked upon him with disdain. The nursery maid was more kindly disposed, but with the 3-year-old Louisa sleeping on the bench, and cheerful baby Charlie laughing from his basket, there was no room for Roddy except on the floor,
And so, for nearly 2 hours, there he sat, humiliated by his mistress's compassion. Exceedingly pleased by the idea of being lady of the manor, Mary Bingley's naturally cheerful and open demeanour added a shade of self-consequent preening as soon as the plan was revealed. Alone with her husband, she removed the bonnet that caused Roddy's disgrace, and laid her head on his broad shoulders. Her hair was one of the many attractions that drew Louis to this daughter of a shopkeeper. A most peculiar tint. It brought to mind his Russian gold snuff-box. Finding a ring with a similarly pink-tinted gold was his first thought on looking at her. Selecting a paste stone in deep blue-green to complete it, immediately followed when her remarkable eyes looked back at him. Being a man of action, he wooed and wed her as soon as his commissioned ring was ready to be placed on her finger. It now graced the delicate hand that lay on his sleeve. She snuggled closer. "Louis, dear, how many bedrooms did your father say we would have?"
"There are 8 family apartments, and a further 8 for guests."
Proving she already knew the answer, her lips moved in unison with her husband's when he replied, "To be mistress of all that would be something." She had only ever lived in town, and the proportions of even the fine homes in Mayfair seemed dwarfed by such a grand house as she would have. She breathed deeply, and soon drifted to sleep, imagining her home and her children's futures. Her daughter would be a fine lady, and her son would grasp what his grandfathers could not touch. She continued to sleep through the change of horses, and never knew that young Roddy reclaimed his self-respect as well as his post. He had, however, changed his loyalty. He was now devoted to cheery little Charlie. The babe had so well rewarded the young man with chortles and babble for every odd grimace he made to entertain him, that Roddy had pledged his fealty to the lad. Mr. Bingley had betrayed him, and he might have turned resentful if it were not for the baby making his shameful ride enjoyable. Preston, the master's valet, observed their interaction and looked on the young man with approval when he resumed his post. While at Netherfield, he took an interest in the boy, teaching him some of the skills of his trade. Roddy, grateful for the almost paternal attention, polished boots along with saddles, and brushed coats after brushing the horses. When young Charles was ready for a valet of his own, Roderick was prepared to serve him. That was yet many years away, and for the nonce we must return to Bingleys, Bennets, and babies. A mere 3 miles from Netherfield was the estate of Thomas Bennet. He was a gentleman from a lineage of gentlemen, and had inherited Longbourn while still a young man. He selected for a bride the daughter of a country solicitor. They had been married a year when his mother-in-law brought over the news that Netherfield was sold. This event occurred very soon after its owner, Mr. Morris, had quit the neighbourhood in distressed circumstances. Armed with such interesting information, the young Mrs. Bennet began visiting the ladies in the remaining 22 households of consequence. Excited speculations grew wings and buzzed through Meryton like a swarm of bees. A month after these stories began, they were dispelled by the wind from the Bingleys' carriages as they drove through the town. Whispered observations of the distinctive paint on the coach, or the high-stepping Yorkshire trotters that pulled it, began to spread instead. They must be quite rich. Not even the Harringtons can boast such handsome horses. Louis and Mary drove through the village, unconscious of the fog of suppositions they parted. Once it was discovered that the new neighbours were still involved in business of some kind, the good people of Meryton were prepared to find the newcomers delightfully unrefined. It was not long after the first visits were paid and returned that Louis was acknowledged to have excellent manners. He behaved with as much gentility as Mayor Lucas, and even his wife was not much worse than Fanny Bennet. Fanny herself was well pleased with Mrs. Bingley, and declared proudly that she would not object to knowing more of her, while sipping tea with Mrs. Lucas. Mary Bingley whispered to her husband that
Frances Bennet is exceedingly pretty, and if she could learn to do with less trimming on her gowns, I could even call her elegant." Neither woman being particularly discriminating, they found they were well satisfied each with the other. Mrs. Bingley's 2 children were much admired. Little Louisa was 3 years old, with soft brown ringlets lit with red, large blue eyes, and an ever-protruding lower lip. Her quiet comportment earned the praise of local matrons, but she was often ignored in favour of bouncing, dimpled 10-month-old Charlie. He was a most engaging infant, and they declared that he was the bonniest baby they had ever seen, each lady privately accepting her own. He was usurped, however, only a year later, when Mr. and Mrs. Bennet christened their rosy, even-tempered Jane. Unusually pretty, the child seemed to have been born smiling. These 2 most fortunate mammas became the closest of companions, visiting almost daily. Presiding over the Longbourn nursery was an elderly woman known to the household as Old Annie. She had been employed at Longbourn since she served as the nursery maid for Mr. Bennet and his younger sister, Lizzie. Annie served as a companion of sorts to his mother when his little sister died of fever. When he was away at Eton, the ladies grieved the child's loss together. After the death of his parents, she became to young Thomas Bennet a second mother. Annie did not get along so well with the new mistress, and as a result she would have been soon pensioned off when Fanny's condition was discovered. Annie insisted that she would take care of the new master as she had done for the current one, and Thomas relented. Once the child was born, Mrs. Bennet pleaded with him to hire a girl to assist her. The request only insulted Annie. "As if she thinks me too old to rock one wee baby! Why, I can tend to the little darling and never mind the aches in my joints from bouncing her up and down the corridor till she sleeps." Mr. Bennet finally agreed to insist on hiring another young girl to help his aging nurse when another child was expected. He did his best to soothe her wounded pride. "Sweet little Jane will require your full attention, and the new baby will be a demanding little devil." Old Annie tutted and tisked at him. Afterwards she defended her honour by remarking to a housemaid, "The young master be so fond of Jane, Angel, that she be. He can't abide for the new babe to take any attention from her. Called it a little devil. He'll change his tune when he sees the little mite, I suppose." The future Mrs. Hill smiled politely and nodded to appease her, but told the cook, "Well, he ought to send his old nurse to a cottage and pension her off, if he's as fond of the child as that. She's standing up now, and will be walking faster than Annie can follow if she can even see her. Wants another pair of eyes in the nursery, he does. Annie is as blind as a bat." Mrs. Bingley soon revealed that she too anticipated another addition to her nursery. The ladies planned and gossiped until summer heat and their confinement separated them. On a sunny morning in early July, Elizabeth Bennet entered the world with large inquisitive eyes and soft yellow curls. Her delivery was easy, and her birth brought only joy. Caroline Bingley arrived with an indignant shout. In mid-August it was a difficult birth, and her mother had been weakened by it. Mary had only a few weeks to rejoice over her healthy and alert little girl. Despite all the reasons for joy, tragedy was determined to triumph, and she succumbed to illness before the month's end. Louis, who was greatly attached to his wife, despaired, and refused to see the daughter who deprived him of his bride. It was unfair to blame an infant, and yet his grief was too raw to be rational for many months. The child was cared for by a nurse who weaned her as early as she could, for as soon as she got her first tooth, Caroline began to bite. In the nursery it was discovered that one must always be careful with the charming little girl. She would smile and gurgle and beguile, but they dared not trust her, for she would bite when least expected. If she was scolded for it, her lower lip would quiver, and inevitably the scold would feel remorse. She was just a baby after all, and was getting her teeth. The poor dear couldn't know what she did.